$40 million that night. Arthur's watch had cost $19 at a drugstore. They had not dressed down to play a trick.
People at this restaurant pay $2,000 a plate, and they do not pay it to smell poverty. You are bad for business, and I am going to count to 3. 1, 2, get out!
You have no idea what it means to be decent. True dignity is something you will never understand.
He called them vagrants. He pointed at their photograph on the wall. He did not know he was pointing at the people who owned everything in that room, including him.
There are evenings when a human life turns not on money, but on how a person chooses to look at a stranger. 40 years ago, a black man slept on the cold tile of a restaurant kitchen floor because he could not afford the $8 for a room, and that night he made himself a promise. If the day ever came when he had everything, he would never forget the feeling of being looked straight through, as if he did not exist. That is the strange arithmetic of being alive. We arrive with empty hands, we leave with empty hands, and everything in between is nothing more than the way we treat one another. And yet people never learn it. They keep using the price of a suit to measure the worth of a soul. The crash of a hand slamming against a table tore straight through the soft piano music drifting across the dining room of Le Ciel. I don't care where the two of you found the nerve to walk in here. Julian Vance loomed over the table, draped in white silk, both palms pressed flat against the polished walnut, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. This table is reserved for the chairman of the corporation. Look at the rags you're wearing. Get out of my restaurant before I have security throw you into the street like garbage. It was 7:43 on a Friday night. The center of the Le Ciel dining room, where the only sounds were usually the chime of crystal and the murmur of people who had never once worried about a bill, had gone utterly still. 40-some diners, every one of them wearing more money on their backs than most families earned in a month, had stopped chewing. They had turned in their chairs. They were watching. At the table sat an old man and an old woman. The man wore a wool overcoat gone soft and pale at the elbows, a coat that had clearly been mended by hand more than once. The woman wore a faded cloth cap and a cardigan the color of weak tea. They did not look afraid. They looked, if anything, tired in the specific way of people who have seen this exact scene play out 100 times in 100 different rooms. "Sir," the old man said quietly, "we only came to have dinner. We're not bothering anyone." That calm was the thing that broke Julian. Fear he could have respected, begging he could have enjoyed. But this serene, unbothered patience felt to him like an insult. Like these two ragged people thought they were better than the rules. "I told you to get up." Julian reached down and grabbed a fistful of the old man's worn coat at the shoulder and yanked him up out of the chair. A button snapped loose and rolled across the marble floor, spinning in a slow, tightening circle before it lay flat. The old man came halfway to his feet, off balance, one hand catching the edge of the table. The old woman was up in an instant. "Take your hand off my husband." Julian turned to her slowly, and when he spoke, his voice dropped to something flat and cold and far more frightening than the shouting had been. "Sit down, old woman. Sit down before I have both of you booked for trespassing and you spend the night in a cell instead of whatever shelter you crawled out of. And here is the part that should make your blood run hot. Not a single person in that room stood up. 40 wealthy diners, men in tailored jackets and women in jewelry worth more than a house, and every last one of them sat frozen in their seats. A man 2 tables over lifted his phone and began to record, a thin smile on his lips. A woman near the window leaned to her companion and whispered something, and they both laughed softly. Someone said, just loud enough to carry, "Just call the police already." The old man straightened himself. He did not pull away. He looked at the hand gripping his coat, then he looked up into Julian's face, and there was something in his eyes that, if Julian had been the kind of man who paid attention, would have stopped him cold. But Julian was not that kind of man. To understand how a grown man with a good salary and a tailored suit walked himself off a cliff in front of 40 witnesses, you have to go back 30 minutes, to 7:13 that same evening, when a yellow cab pulled up to the curb outside La Cille, and two people who could have bought the entire block stepped out into the rain. Arthur Sterling was 71 years old. His wife Martha was 69. Between them, that night, they were worth a little over $340 million, though neither of them had carried cash in years, and Arthur's watch had cost him $19 at a drugstore. They had not dressed down to play a trick. They had dressed in the actual clothes, pulled from the actual cedar chest at the foot of their bed, that they had worn 40 years ago on the night they opened the first tiny location of what was then called simply Sterling's, a 12-seat room with a leaking roof and a single second-hand range. It was their anniversary, 40 years to the day, and Arthur had an idea that had been bothering Martha for a week. "I want to see it the way a stranger sees it," he had told her over breakfast. "Not the way they show it to me when they know I'm coming. We built 91 restaurants on one promise, Martha, that anyone who walks through the door gets treated like they matter. I want to know if that promise is still alive, or if it died somewhere along the way and nobody told us." Martha had set down her coffee. "And if it died, then we find out who killed it." So they did not call ahead. They did not bring security. They put on the old coat and the faded cap, and they took a cab to the flagship, the crown jewel of the empire, the restaurant called La Cille, that the company's marketing materials described as the most exclusive dining room in the city. Tables booked 3 months out, a minimum spend of $2,000, and at its heart, lit by a single brass picture lamp, the founder's table, draped in white silk and kept empty for 5 years as a kind of shrine. Arthur and Martha walked in, shook the rain off their shoulders, and walked straight to that table and sat down. The young woman at the host stand, a girl of maybe 22 named Priya, looked up with a flicker of confusion, and then, to her great credit, a flicker of warmth. She took one step toward them with a menu in her hand, and that was when Julian Vance intercepted her. "I've got this," he said, taking the menus from her and setting them face down on the host stand. "Watch the door." Julian was 38 and had managed La Cille for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had built an entire private philosophy out of the idea that he could read a person's worth in 3 seconds. The cut of a coat, the brand of a handbag, the quality of a pair of shoes. He was proud of this skill. He thought it made him discerning. He did not understand that it made him a small man with a very expensive blindfold. He crossed the floor toward the founder's table without a menu and without a smile. "I'm sorry," he said, and the word sorry in his mouth had no apology in it at all. "Are you two lost? The free soup kitchen is about 3 blocks east. This table requires a minimum spend of $2,000. Arthur looked up at him with mild, friendly eyes. "We're here to eat. This spot suits us fine. This spot." Julian let out a short laugh. He glanced around to see who was watching, the way men like him always do, performing for an audience even when there isn't one yet. "This spot is a memorial table for the anonymous founders of this restaurant group. Not one person sits here, not the mayor, not a senator. It has been empty for 5 years out of respect. And you want me to believe 2 people who walked in soaking wet in clothes from a donation bin belong at it?" "We don't want you to believe anything," Martha said gently. "We'd just like to see a menu." The patience again, the maddening calm. Julian felt his face go hot. There were, in fact, 3 people in that room who felt something was wrong. Priya at the host stand had gone still, her hand half raised as if to say something and then thinking better of it. A young server named Daniel, 2 years out of culinary school and barely making rent, had stopped at the edge of the dining room with a tray of water glasses, watching with a knot forming in his stomach. And, from somewhere near the kitchen pass, an older man in a chef's whites had glanced up at the founder's table, frozen, his face slowly draining of color. But Julian saw none of them. Julian saw only 2 poor people refusing to be ashamed, and that refusal was a challenge he could not let stand. "Let me make this simple," he said, leaning down, lowering his voice into that intimate register that bullies use to make cruelty feel private. "People at this restaurant pay $2,000 a plate, and they do not pay it to smell poverty while they eat. You are an embarrassment. You are bad for business. And I am going to count to 3. And if you are not on your feet and moving toward that door, I am going to have you removed." Martha looked at the great black and white photograph hanging on the wall behind him, the one lit by the single brass lamp. It showed a young couple standing in front of a tiny, battered kitchen, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders, both of them grinning like the future belonged to them. Then she looked back at Julian. "If this is the founder's table," she said, "why don't you serve us the way you'd serve the founders?" Julian laughed out loud. It was a hollow, contemptuous sound, and it carried across the silent room. He straightened and flung an arm toward the photograph as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. "Are you delusional? Look at that picture. Look at it. That is Mr. Arthur Sterling and Miss Martha Sterling. Legends. They came from nothing and built a culinary empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They are royalty. They are the reason every person in this room had to wait 3 months for a reservation. And you," he swept his hand back toward the old couple, his lip curling. "You are two vagrants who wandered in off the street to make a scene. Do not insult their memory by sitting at their table." It was the single most ironic sentence Julian Vance would ever say in his life, and he had no idea. Arthur and Martha said nothing. They simply looked at him. You have to understand what that silence was. It was not weakness. It was not the silence of people who have no answer. It was the silence of people who hold absolute power and have learned, over a long lifetime, that the loudest thing in any room is a fool who has not yet finished talking. They were not enduring Julian. They were giving him rope. They were letting his arrogance run all the way to its natural end, because they knew something he did not. That a man reveals exactly who he is in the way he treats people who cannot fight back, and that the truest verdict a person ever receives is the one he writes for himself. Daniel, the young server, set down his tray. He took a half step forward, his throat tight. "Mr. Vance," he said quietly, "maybe we could just get back to your station," Julian snapped without even turning around, "unless you'd like to join them on the sidewalk." Daniel stopped. He looked at the old couple, and something in him curdled with shame, and he stayed where he was. He would remember that half step and that stopping for the rest of his life. Julian turned back to the table. "I'm done being polite." 1. Martha reached across the white silk and laid her hand over her husband's. 2. Julian's jaw was tight. "People like you contaminate the very air in here." A ripple of laughter from the next table. The woman by the window again. "Call the police already." And then Arthur Sterling set down his napkin and he stood up. He stood the rest of the way up, slowly, the way a much younger man might rise from a throne. He reached up with one steady hand and pulled the faded cloth cap from his head, and a crown of close-cropped silver hair caught the light. Then he took off his glasses and folded them and slipped them into the breast pocket of the worn coat. And the chandelier overhead, a cascade of cut crystal worth more than Julian's annual salary, poured its light directly down onto a face that was lined and weathered and absolutely, unmistakably full of authority. "You're right, Julian," Arthur said, and his voice had changed. It was no longer soft, it was low and clear, and it filled the room the way a hand fills a glove. "That photograph was taken 40 years ago. Time turns your hair gray. It wears holes in your coat. It bends your back." He let the words sit in the dead silent room. "But it does not change the face of the man in the picture." Julian frowned. The first thread of something cold pulled tight in his stomach. He squinted at the old man. Then, almost against his own will, his head turned toward the great black and white photograph on the wall. He looked at the eyes of the young man in the picture, deep-set and dark and certain. Then he looked at the eyes of the old man standing 2 feet in front of him. He looked at the line of the jaw in the photograph, then at the jaw of the man before him. He looked at the gentle, knowing smile of the young woman in the picture, her head tilted just slightly. Then he looked at Martha, who tilted her head just slightly, and smiled. The music had long since stopped. No one in the room was breathing. The match was exact. It was exact in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of Julian's neck. The same face, only 40 years older. The same eyes, the same quiet, terrible certainty. And in that frozen, airless moment, the door to the main kitchen banged open. The man in the chef's whites came through it almost at a run. He was in his 60s, French, with a silver mustache and flowers still on his forearms, and his name was Henri Lacroix, and he was the executive chef of Le Ciel, and he was the only person still working in that entire the very building who had been there at the very beginning, who had stood in that 12-seat room with the leaking roof and learned to cook on that single second-hand range. He had seen the old couple from across the dining room 4 minutes ago, and he had not been able to believe his eyes, and then he had been able to believe them, and then he had run. He crossed the floor and walked straight past Julian as if the manager were a piece of furniture. And then Henri Lacroix, executive chef of the most exclusive restaurant in the city, stopped in front of the two ragged people at the founder's table and bent at the waist into a deep, trembling bow 90 degrees, his eyes wet. Monsieur Sterling, Madame Sterling. His voice cracked on the words, "Welcome home. Welcome back to your own restaurant." The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple of it reached every single table. You could see the understanding move through the crowd in stages. First, the diners closest to the table, who heard the chef's words directly and went rigid. Then the tables behind them as the whisper traveled. Then the far corners of the room, where people half rose from their seats to see. The man who had been recording on his phone slowly lowered it, his thin smile gone, his face suddenly slack with the dawning horror of what he had just captured. The woman by the window, who had twice called for the police, pressed a hand to her own mouth, and Julian Vance stood at the center of it all, and the color drained out of his face in a single visible wave, from red to gray to a white as pale as the silk on the table. Everything he was, or thought he was, came apart at once. The arrogance, the certainty, the 6 years of believing he could measure a human being at a glance. All of it was being pulled out of him in real time, in front of 40 witnesses, in front of the chef, in front of the 2 people he had just threatened with jail. He took a step backward and his knees buckled, and he had to grab the edge of a neighboring table to keep from going down. A water glass tipped over and rolled and shattered on the floor, and no one moved to clean it up. Mr. Chairman, he stammered. His mouth had gone dry. The words came out broken. I didn't know. I didn't, sir. I swear to God, I didn't know it was you." Arthur looked at him with eyes that held no warmth and no cruelty either, only a vast and final clarity. "That," he said, "is precisely the point." But Julian's eyes darted to the worn coat, the snapped button still lying somewhere on the floor, the faded cap in Arthur's hand, as if the clothes themselves might still save him, might still prove he had been reasonable. "But your clothes, sir, how was I supposed to? Anyone would have your clothes?" "These clothes," Arthur said, and his voice did not rise, which made it land all the harder, "are what my wife and I wore on the night we opened our first kitchen 40 years ago, with nothing in the bank and everything to lose. We washed dishes in these clothes. We slept on the floor in these clothes." He paused. "And tonight we put them on again for one reason. I wanted to know how the empire I built treats a person who appears to have nothing. I wanted to walk into my own house through the eyes of the poorest man who might ever push that door open." He let that hang. "You gave me my answer in under 5 minutes." Julian's lips moved, but nothing came out. Somewhere behind him, Daniel the young server had tears standing in his eyes, and Priya at the host stand had both hands pressed over her heart. Here is the thing that men like Julian never understand until it is far too late. In that moment, he was not yet finished. There was still a door open to him, narrow but real. If he had dropped to his knees, if he had said simply and truly, "I was wrong, I have been wrong for a long time, and I am ashamed," the story might have bent toward mercy. Arthur Sterling had spent 40 years giving second chances to people the world had written off. He was watching even now to see which man Julian would choose to be. But Julian could not do it. The same arrogance that had built the cliff would not let him step back from the edge. "Sir, with respect," he said, and incredibly, unbelievably, a defensive edge crept back into his voice, "I was protecting your restaurant. I was protecting your brand. If we let just anyone sit at this table, what message does that send to the paying clientele? I made a judgment call. It was the wrong call, obviously, but it was a reasonable." "Stop." Arthur did not shout it. He simply said it, and Julian stopped. "You were not protecting my restaurant," Arthur said. "You were protecting your own contempt. You dressed it up as standards, and you called it judgment. But it was never anything more than the oldest, ugliest thing a man can carry in his chest. You looked at 2 human beings and you decided that dignity could be measured by the wear on their coats. He shook his head slowly. Do you know what the message is, Julian, that you send to the paying clientele? You teach them that this place worships money instead of people. And the day a restaurant believes that is the day it stops being worth a single dollar of the 2,000 you're so proud of. He turned to Henri Lacroix, who was standing now with his hands clasped, waiting. Henri, pull his access card. Tonight. Have security walk him out through the kitchen, the same way we'd walk out anyone who put his hands on a guest. Arthur looked back at Julian one final time. You're not being fired because you didn't recognize me. You'd have kept your job if you'd treated a stranger with decency and simply made an honest mistake. You're being fired, Julian, because of exactly who you became when you were certain no one important was watching. 2 security officers had appeared at the edges of the room. They did not rush. They walked to either side of Julian Vance and stood there, and the message of their presence was unmistakable. Julian tried one last time to speak. He opened his mouth, and for a man who had filled this room with cruelty only minutes before, it was a strange and pitiful thing that now no sound came out at all. His eyes swept the dining room, searching for one ally, one sympathetic face among the 40 diners he had been so eager to impress. He found none. The same wealthy crowd that had sat in silent complicity while he tormented an old couple now looked at him with open contempt. And there is no loneliness quite like being despised by the very people you sold your soul to please. They walked him out through the kitchen. The door swung shut behind him, and that was the last anyone at Le Ciel ever saw of Julian Vance. For a long moment the room stayed silent. Then Arthur Sterling did something that no one expected. He turned to the 40 diners who had watched the whole thing and done nothing. And he did not lecture them. He simply pulled out the chair across from his own, the founder's chair that had sat empty for 5 years, and he held it for his wife. Martha, he said softly, we came here to have dinner. Let's have dinner. Martha Sterling sat. Arthur eased himself down across from her and reached for the bottle of wine that Henri was already, with shaking hands, hurrying to pour. He raised his glass to his wife of 45 years, and the 2 of them touched the rims together with a small, clear note that rang out into the hush. But Arthur was not quite finished, and what he did next is the part of this story worth carrying home. He raised one hand and beckoned, and Daniel, the young server, came forward on unsteady legs, certain he was about to be dismissed along with his manager for the half-step he had taken and then abandoned. You tried to speak up, Arthur said. I saw it. You were afraid, and you stopped. And you've been ashamed of yourself for the last 10 minutes. I know, because I can see it on your face. He let a small smile reach his eyes for the first time that evening. Fear is human, son. What matters is that the decency in you was real, even when the courage came up short. We can build courage. We cannot build the decency. You already have the part that can't be taught. He looked past Daniel to Priya at the host stand, who had stepped toward them with a menu when no one else would. Both of you, Arthur said, come see me Monday morning at the head office. There's room in this company for people who treat a stranger like he matters. He glanced toward the kitchen door. We just made an opening, and so it was that on a rainy Friday night at a table that had sat empty for 5 years, an old man and an old woman in clothes from 40 years ago ate the finest meal that the most exclusive restaurant in the city could produce, while the 2 youngest, poorest, kindest people on the staff stood nearby having just been handed the future. The greatest weapon of people who truly hold power is not designer clothing, and it is not the ability to shout the loudest in a quiet room. It is stillness. It is the patience to let an arrogant man speak until he has fully described himself, and then to let that description stand as the sentence. Arthur Sterling never raised his voice. He never had to. He simply gave Julian Vance enough silence to dig his own grave, and a fool with a shovel will always finish the job. The lesson tonight is as old as the human race, and we still cannot seem to learn it. Never measure the worth of a person by the clothes on their back, because you will never know until it is far too late, that the man you are grinding under your heel may be the man who owns the very ground you are standing on. The cab driver you sneered at, the woman in the worn coat you stepped past, the quiet old man at the table you tried to clear, any one of them may be carrying a weight of wisdom or wealth or power that would make your knees buckle the way Julian's did. And even if they are not, even if they truly have nothing, they are still owed the one thing that costs you nothing at all to give: dignity. If this story moved you, take a moment to leave one word in the comments. The name of someone who treated you with kindness when you had nothing to offer them in return. Let's fill that space with the people who got it right. And if you believe a person's worth was never meant to be measured in dollars, subscribe and stay with us, because we tell these stories every week, and there is always another one coming. Arrogance is only ever the first step. The fall is always the second.